The year is 73 AD. You are chained in a stone cell beneath the Colosseum, the greatest monument to death ever constructed by human hands. Just hours ago, you watched through iron bars as your husband was dragged into the arena above. You heard the roar of 50,000 Roman voices as a lion was released. You heard his screams. You heard the moment when the screaming stopped. Now the torches are burning low. The crowd has dispersed into the Roman night, their bloodlust temporarily satisfied. The stone walls around you are damp with moisture that might be water or might be something worse. Then you hear them, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoing through the tunnels beneath the arena. A shadow falls across your cell door, blocking what little light remains. It's a gladiator, still wearing his armor, still covered in blood that clearly isn't his own. He survived today's slaughter, he performed well, and now he's come to claim his reward. A guard approaches with keys, the lock turns. This isn't a scene from a horror film. This was Tuesday in the Roman Empire. What I am about to reveal to you is the systematic machinery of nightmare that operated beneath Rome's greatest monuments, a state-sponsored system of horror that historians spent centuries trying to ignore or explain away. This isn't speculation built on rumor or conspiracy. This is documented by Roman writers themselves, carved into the very stones beneath the amphitheaters that still stand today. The evidence has always been there, waiting in the darkness beneath the glory of empire. If you stay with me until the end, you will never look at the ancient world the same way again. You lions understand that the true horror of Rome was what happened in the bright sunlight of the arena floor. It was what happened in the hours after the crowds went home, when spectacle transformed into something far more sinister. Hollywood has been lying to you about gladiators for generations. Films like Gladiator and Spartacus show you the blood and the steel, the honor and the rebellion, the dramatic deaths beneath the Mediterranean sun. What they never show you is what happened when the public performance ended, when the carefully choreographed violence gave way to something that had no audience, no witnesses, no one to bear testimony. Modern historians have created a Latin term for this system, Victoria Carnales, the carnal victory. But here's what should chill you to your bones. The Romans themselves never called it that. To them, it wasn't remarkable enough to need a special name. It was simply normal, an expected part of how empire functioned, as routine as tax collection or road maintenance. Here's what we know for certain. Roman writers, including Martial Juvenal and Seneca, documented a world where conquered women were housed beneath arenas and distributed as prizes, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally handed out like equipment to gladiators who had performed well in the day's games. The Roman state itself, the same government that built aqueducts and established law codes that would influence civilization for 2,000 years, operated this system with bureaucratic efficiency. Think carefully about what this means. The same culture that gave us concrete and representative government, that created literature and philosophy we still study today, also perfected the industrialization of sexual violence. They didn't hide it out of shame. They recorded it in ledgers. They built specialized rooms for it beneath their greatest monuments. They assigned officials to manage it. Before we descend deeper into this darkness, I need you to understand something. This story matters not because it's shocking, but because it reveals what empires do when they believe no one is watching, when they're convinced that might makes right, when they've convinced themselves that some human beings aren't really human at all. If you believe that hidden history deserves to be exposed, even when it makes us deeply uncomfortable, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Because this isn't just about Rome. This is about what happens when civilization stops seeing certain people as people. Now let's descend into the hypogeum, the vast network of tunnels and chambers beneath the arena floor. To understand what happened in those underground cells, you first have to understand how Rome turned human beings into inventory. This wasn't random cruelty committed by sadistic individuals. This was systematic dehumanization on an industrial scale, and it started the moment Roman legions conquered new territory. When Rome crushed a rebellion in Gaul or annihilated a city in Judea, they didn't just win a military victory. They processed an entire population like a factory assembly line for human suffering. Men of military age were sent to die in mines or arenas. Children were sold to slave markets scattered across the empire, shipped to places where they would never again hear their native language or see anyone who remembered their real names. Women were designated as captivae, were prizes belonging to the state itself. Here's where Roman lore reveals its true horror. These people weren't legally human anymore. They were classified as race, things, property, the exact same legal category as furniture or livestock. A conquered woman had no more rights under Roman law than a chair. Anything done to her was not technically a crime, because you cannot commit a crime against an object. You cannot murder a piece of furniture. You cannot assault property. This wasn't some obscure legal technicality. This was foundational to how the entire system functioned. But Rome didn't just dehumanize people through law. They dehumanized them through spectacle. The games weren't merely entertainment. They were political theater designed to psychologically dominate both the conquered peoples and Rome's own citizens. When you watched a captured Germanic chieftain torn apart by lions, you weren't just seeing a man die. You were watching Rome demonstrate to everyone in that arena and everyone in the empire what happens to anyone who defies Roman power. And here's what they don't tell you in school. During the midday lull in the games, when the elite left for lunch, that's when the true sadism emerged. Historians call these events fatal charades, mythological reenactments where condemned prisoners were forced to act out famous myths, except the deaths were absolutely real. The poet Martial, writing in the 1st century with the casual tone of a restaurant reviewer, describes a prisoner dressed as Orpheus, the legendary musician who could charm any creature with his song. They led him into the arena with a lie released a bear, and Martial notes with disappointment that this time the music didn't work as the animal tore the man apart while thousands of spectators ate honeyed dates and discussed dinner plans. But Martial describes something even more disturbing, and I'm warning you now that what comes next is deeply upsetting. He writes about a woman forced to reenact the myth of Pasiphae, who in legend mated with a sacred bull. For this prisoner, it meant being publicly assaulted by an animal in front of thousands of spectators until she died from her injuries. Read that again slowly. The Roman state designed and operated a system where human beings were raped to death by animals as lunchtime entertainment between the morning and noon combat programs. This wasn't the sick fantasy of one deranged emperor. This was decades of standard operating procedure. Senators brought their children to watch. The events were advertised on walls throughout the city. Vendors sold snacks. Martial himself writes that, whatever myth tells us, the arena makes real, and he means this as a compliment, as praise for the efficiency and creativity of the system. This was the environment, this industrialized bureaucratic machinery of cruelty, that also processed conquered women into the reward system for gladiators. And the men who received these rewards existed in a contradiction that Rome never fully resolved simultaneously: the lowest and highest members of society, slaves with less legal status than dogs, about celebrities whose faces appeared on mosaics and whose names were graffitied on walls by adoring fans throughout the empire. Women of the aristocracy were obsessed with gladiators in ways that scandalized even permissive Roman society. Ancient graffiti from Pompeii, preserved forever when Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, calls one gladiator the sigh of the girls and another the glory of the ladies. There are documented cases of noble women bribing guards for access to gladiator barracks, sneaking out of their palatial homes at night to spend hours with enslaved fighters who could be executed on a whim. The gladiator Sergius apparently conducted affairs with multiple married patrician women, causing scandals that echoed through Rome's gossip networks. Even stranger, their bodily fluids were commodified. Gladiator sweat was collected after fights, mixed with olive oil, and sold as an aphrodisiac and beauty treatment to wealthy women. Think about that level of celebrity worship. These are enslaved men whose perspiration is being bottled and marketed to the upper classes. But Rome lived in absolute terror of these same men. The Spartacus rebellion of 73 BC was burned into Roman cultural memory like a brand. 78 gladiators escaped from a training school, raised an army of 70,000 enslaved people, and nearly brought Rome to its knees. For 2 years, they humiliated legion after legion, defeating some of Rome's finest generals. When Rome finally crushed them, they crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way, one body every 40 meters for 200 kilometers, a forest of crosses stretching from Rome to Capua. That trauma never left the Roman psyche. Every time a gladiator picked up a sword, everyone remembered that these men had once come terrifyingly close to burning Rome to the ground. So, how do you control incredibly dangerous, incredibly valuable men who have legitimate grievances and the combat skills to act on them? You use a combination of brutal punishment and calculated rewards. Extra food rations, prize money, the promise of freedom after enough victories. But the sources hint at something else, something more primal that the Romans documented in ledgers, but described only vaguely in literature, as if it were too obvious to explain in detail: access to conquered women. The documentation here is frustratingly scattered, mentioned in passing by writers who assumed their audiences understood the context. But when you piece together references from Martial, Juvenal, and later sources, when you cross-reference with what we know about military rewards and slave management practices, a pattern emerges. After particularly impressive victories, especially during major games funded by emperors or wealthy senators, gladiators who survived and fought well were given what ancient sources vaguely refer to as privileges of the victor. Modern historians, reading between the lines and examining the archaeological evidence, believe this often meant access to female captives held in specialized chambers beneath the arena. The process appears to have been chillingly bureaucratic. The gladiator would be escorted down into the hypogeum still wearing his armor, still covered in the blood and sand of the arena floor. A litis official or arena administrator would accompany him through tunnels, lit by oil lamps, past the animal cages where tomorrow's beasts paced in darkness, past the mechanical lifts that would raise condemned prisoners to their deaths, until they reached a specific section of holding cells. These weren't general prison areas. Archaeological evidence from amphitheaters across the empire, from Capua to Pompeii to beneath the Colosseum itself, reveals small chambers with distinctive and disturbing features. Stone benches built at specific heights, iron rings anchored into walls at waist height and near the floor, doors that lock exclusively from the outside. Some rooms show evidence of chains permanently mounted to the architecture itself. The women held in these cells were called captivae ad damnati. Condemned were captives. They'd already been processed through Rome's bureaucracy of conquest, their names recorded in ledgers by officials called commentarii who tracked state property with the same attention to detail they used for tracking grain shipments or military equipment. Each woman was assigned a number and a category based on her origin: Germanica, Britannica, Parthica, labels that erased their real names and reduced them to their conquered status. The gladiator would be shown a row of cells. Some accounts suggest he could choose. Others imply women were simply assigned like equipment being checked out of a warehouse. Either way, a guard would unlock the designated cell. The woman would be brought out or the gladiator would enter. The door would close and lock again. What happened next isn't described in explicit detail in surviving sources, but the architecture tells the story, the text won't. The iron rings, the benches, the locks on the outside of doors, the scratch marks on walls where fingernails tried desperately to dig through solid stone. Here's what makes this especially sinister. This wasn't a crime in Roman eyes. It wasn't even viewed as morally questionable by most Romans. This was part of the operational budget of the games. The logistics of Victoria Carnalis were handled by the same administrators who scheduled animal fights and maintained arena equipment. From the state's perspective, this system solved multiple problems elegantly. It rewarded loyal gladiators cheaply, since conquered women cost the state nothing as they were already classified as spoils of war. It reinforced the gladiator's sense of power and privilege without actually giving him any real freedom or legal status. And it sent a message to both the gladiator and the conquered peoples. This is what Roman dominance means. Your victory in the arena earns you the same rights the emperor has: absolute power over the conquered. Let's talk about the physical spaces where this happened, because the archaeology is damning. When archaeologists first excavated beneath the Colosseum in the 19th century, they were primarily interested in the impressive engineering, the elevator systems that lifted animals to arena level, the complex tunnels for moving personnel and equipment. But as excavations continued into the 20th century, they found something they hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to interpret: specialized chambers that served no obvious logistical purpose. These rooms are small, typically 10 to 15 square meters. They're located in a separate section of the hypogeum, deliberately away from animal cages and gladiator preparation rooms. Their distinctive features are what make modern archaeologists deeply uncomfortable. Stone benches line the walls, but unlike benches in other chambers, these are built at a specific height that serves no practical purpose for rest or storage. Iron rings are anchored into the walls at multiple heights, some at floor level, some at waist height, some higher. The doors are heavy wood reinforced with iron, and crucially, they all lock from the outside only. The walls in several chambers show evidence of scratching, desperate fingernails trying to dig through solid stone. Here's what makes this especially sinister: this wasn't a crime in Roman eyes. It wasn't even viewed as morally questionable by most Romans. This was part of the operational budget of the games. The logistics of Victoria Carnalis were handled by the same administrators who scheduled animal fights and maintained arena equipment. From the state's perspective, this system solved multiple problems elegantly. It rewarded loyal gladiators cheaply, since conquered women cost the state nothing as they were already classified as spoils of war. It reinforced the gladiator's sense of power and privilege without actually giving him any real freedom or legal status. And it sent a message to both the gladiator and the conquered peoples. This is what Roman dominance means. Your victory in the arena earns you the same rights the emperor has: absolute power over the conquered. Let's talk about the physical spaces where this happened, because the archaeology is damning. When archaeologists first excavated beneath the Colosseum in the 19th century, they were primarily interested in the impressive engineering, the elevator systems that lifted animals to arena level, the complex tunnels for moving personnel and equipment. But as excavations continued into the 20th century, they found something they hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to interpret: specialized chambers that served no obvious logistical purpose. These rooms are small, typically 10 to 15 square meters. They're located in a separate section of the hypogeum, deliberately away from animal cages and gladiator preparation rooms. Their distinctive features are what make modern archaeologists deeply uncomfortable. Stone benches line the walls, but unlike benches in other chambers, these are built at a specific height that serves no practical purpose for rest or storage. Iron rings are anchored into the walls at multiple heights, some at floor level, some at waist height, some higher. The doors are heavy wood reinforced with iron, and crucially, they all lock from the outside only. The walls in several chambers show evidence of scratching, desperate fingernails trying to dig through solid stone. But the most disturbing evidence comes from graffiti. In the hypogeum beneath the amphitheater in Capua, the same city where Spartacus launched his rebellion, archaeologists found scratch marks on cell walls. Some are in Latin, others in languages from across the empire. Most are fragmentary, damaged by time and moisture, but a few are legible. 1. Written in crude Latin by someone clearly not a native speaker, translates roughly to: I was Aemilia of the Brigantes. I saw my children killed. Now I am nothing. Another, in what appears to be a Celtic language, has been translated as: to any god who listens, let me die before tomorrow. These aren't the voices history typically preserves. Roman chronicles name emperors and generals, track military victories and architectural achievements. They don't record the names of conquered women cataloged as property in state ledgers. But the stones remember, the architecture itself is testimony. This system was designed for efficiency and repetition. These weren't improvised locations. They were purpose-built, maintained facilities with specific design features meant to facilitate what happened inside them. Compare this to how Rome handled other aspects of gladiatorial management, and the pattern becomes undeniable. Gladiator barracks, animal facilities, weapon storage, every element of arena infrastructure was carefully planned and standardized across the empire. The captive chambers fit the exact same pattern. This was state-sponsored infrastructure for systematic abuse, built with the same engineering excellence Rome applied to its aqueducts and roads. Now we have to confront the hardest part of this story. What this actually meant for the women trapped in this machinery. History is almost completely silent on their individual experiences. We don't have diaries, we don't have testimony. What we have are ledgers that list them as numbers and property inventories that describe them like livestock. Female, Germanic, approximately 20 years, good health, assigned to Colosseum holding. But we can reconstruct the nightmare from what we know about the conquest process and the documented experiences of other captives. These women weren't random prisoners. They came from specific contexts of absolute trauma. When Rome conquered a region that resisted, during the Dacian Wars, or the suppression of the Britannic revolt led by Boudicca, the aftermath followed methodical Roman military procedure. After the final battle, the civilian population would be processed. Men of fighting age were killed immediately or enslaved for hard labor in mines where life expectancy was measured in months. Children under a certain age were separated and sold to slave markets in the Eastern Empire where they would never again see their homeland or hear their native language. Women of childbearing age were designated as captivae and transported in chains to holding facilities. For a woman in this situation, the journey to the arena was already a descent through multiple circles of hell. You watched your village burn, you saw your children torn from your arms, screaming. You were chained to dozens of other women and marched hundreds of miles to Rome, with no explanation, no information about where you were going or what would happen. You were stripped, examined like livestock by Roman officials who discussed your value while you stood naked before them. You were assigned a number. You were locked in a cell beneath the greatest monument to the civilization that destroyed everything you knew. And the waiting was its own form of torture. You could hear everything. The roar of the crowd above as people you might have known were executed in creative ways for entertainment. The screams of animals being slaughtered. The cheers when a gladiator delivered a particularly skillful killing blow. And you knew with absolute certainty that you would never leave. There was no ransom system, no prisoner exchange. Rome didn't negotiate with the conquered. Your people back home, if any survived, would never know what happened to you. You would simply disappear into the machinery of empire. Then came the footsteps. The cell door opening, the choice being made, the door closing and locking again with you on the wrong side of it, with a man who just spent the afternoon killing people for entertainment while 50,000 voices cheered. Roman law provided no protection because legally you weren't a person. You couldn't appeal to magistrates. You couldn't even commit suicide, one of the few escapes Roman culture sometimes viewed with tragic respect, because if you somehow managed it, you'd be depriving the state of its property and your body would still be used just differently. This was psychological warfare on a civilizational scale. The systematic humiliation of conquered women wasn't a side effect of Roman military policy. It was a deliberate strategy documented in military manuals and historical accounts. The goal was to break the spirit of resistance so thoroughly that future generations wouldn't even dare to think about defying Rome. Ancient sources make this explicit. After crushing the Jewish revolt in 70 AD, the historian Josephus records that Romans deliberately distributed Jewish women among the legions and to the games specifically to demonstrate to survivors that they had lost not only their sovereignty, but any ability to protect their families. The message was unmistakable: resist Rome, and this is what happens to your daughters. your sisters, your wives. In the end, what should haunt us most about this system is how normal it was to the Romans themselves. They didn't hide it out of shame, they recorded it in administrative documents. They built permanent infrastructure for it. They mentioned it casually in literature, the way we might mention office procedures. This wasn't the work of monsters who knew they were committing evil. This was the work of ordinary people who had convinced themselves that some human beings simply weren't human, that conquest gave them the right to do anything to anyone, that empire justified everything. The Roman Empire fell 1500 years ago, but the logic that powered systems like Victoria Carnalis never fully disappeared. Every time a civilization decides that some group of people doesn't deserve full humanity, every time an empire convinces itself that its victims aren't really victims, we see echoes of Rome's darkness. The lesson isn't that Romans were uniquely evil. The lesson is that ordinary people in powerful civilizations can convince themselves that almost anything is normal, is justified, is simply the way things work. The stones beneath the Colosseum still stand, and if you listen carefully in those tunnels, you can almost hear what history tried to forget. The question we have to ask ourselves is this: what are we convinced is normal right now that future generations will look back on with the same horror we feel looking at Rome? If this story affected you, if you believe these voices from the darkness deserve to be remembered, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think about how we remember history, about what empires hide, about whose stories get told and whose get buried beneath monuments. This isn't just ancient history. This is about how power works, how dehumanization functions, how civilizations justify the unjustifiable. Your thoughts matter. The conversation matters. Let's not let these voices be forgotten again.